What happened was that I wrote that, it was published, and I couldn't think what to do next. I mean, the publishers came to me and said, when is the next Sherlock Holmes pastiche coming out? And I thought, well, you know, I didn't want to make a career of this. I mean, this was, as far as I was concerned, it was a one-off. I mean, apart from anything else, it seemed to me that I'd fairly comprehensively killed him at the end of the book. I mean, at least as comprehensively as Conan Doyle did, you know, in the final problem. So I couldn't see any way to deal with that. And in fact, that was when I went off to Italy and did my 4 years, you know, teaching English there. And then while I was there, I got interested in two things. One was getting back into being published and into writing, you know, crime mystery novels. But I also got interested because, as you say, I was living in Perugia, but this is quite close to Florence. I mean, that's the easiest place to get to from Perugia. It's about, you know, sort of 70, 80 miles, easy train journey, easy drive. So I used to go there quite a bit, and I got interested in the Brownings, who lived there in the 1880s. I mean, he was a poet. She was also a poet, indeed the far more famous poet at the time, particularly over here in America. She was very much, you know, a sort of feminist before her time, and was highly regarded. And sort of one thing led to another, so I ended up writing that, you know, partly as a way of getting back into the publishing field by doing something which was similar but not exactly the same.
And then you started the first of your 5 Aurelio's Inn. I hate to call them police procedurals because I think that connotes some things that they are not, but basically Aurelio's Inn is an Italian policeman, and I can't imagine anyone who can write about Italy without having to deal with the labyrinthine structure, the corruption, the intricate nature of Italian society, and it seems to me that you do that brilliantly in those books. In fact, you did it so brilliantly in Rat King that you won the Gold Dagger for Best Mystery Novel of the Year from the British Crime Writers Association, and it was well deserved. Yeah, well, that was my 3rd book. That was obviously the breakthrough book. It was also the first one that wasn't a pastiche. You know, it was based on my Italian experiences, and as you said, Barbara, this is a police procedural, but it's a police procedural of a certain kind, in the sense that it's a police procedural in a country where bureaucracy has a higher profile than, you know, anyone who lives here can imagine. Right. I mean, we tend to feel that, you know, if you need some sort of license or permit or whatever, you can probably call a 1-800 number, or at worst, you know, mail it in, or if you really have to actually go somewhere, it'll take like 5 minutes. You go in, they stamp it, and you come out. In Italy, and indeed in many of, you know, the Latin countries, bureaucracy is actually a way of life. Exactly. An Italian friend of mine said that the reason why Italian families tend to be sort of extended rather than nuclear families is because everyone needs a grandmother who has nothing else to do than either look after the kids or spend the whole day down at the town hall lining up to get, you know, the permit so that you can sort of keep chickens in the backyard or something, you know. So being a policeman in a culture like that is and the whole sort of procedural side of it is rather different from, you know, in Britain or in America, where one sort of tends to take the procedural side. I mean, it's sort of interesting, but you kind of take it for granted and assume that these are people who really just want to get on with their job and so on, and this is paperwork they have to do on the side. In Italy, it's very different. I mean, the paperwork, or the implications of the paperwork, loom much larger, and they take up much more of their time. And so Zen spends most of his time not actually trying to solve the case, but trying to figure out whether it's in his best interest to solve the case. True enough, and there's an intense psychological aspect to the police procedurals that you don't always get with something more like an Ed McBain 87th Precinct, or where procedure is more to rule. I love the title of Rat King, and I presume that it's that rat's nest family from which the kidnapped victim is taken that caused you to call it that. Well, this is one of these things that was handed to me on a plate, actually. While I lived in Italy, I had a subscription to a British magazine, and in it there was a review by Patricia Highsmith of a book by a Dutch writer called Rats. Not with an exclamation mark at the end. Right. And this was everything,
you want to know or maybe don't want to know about rats. And there was a whole chapter devoted to this thing called the Rat King, which I knew nothing about, and clearly Patricia Highsmith didn't know anything about either, because she spent a lot of time talking about it. And it seemed to me absolutely fascinating, and I assumed that Patricia would use it for, for her next book, because she was then alive, of course. But she didn't. So I thought, well, okay, I'll grab it. It's just too good to let go. And as you say, I mean, it's the idea of, and apparently this is a phenomenon which has been well attested. They have, sort of cadavers in the sub-basements of museums in various places in Europe, and also X-ray photographs which they've taken. It's what happens when a lot of rats are in a very enclosed space, and somehow they seem to have some sort of reflex action with their tails, a bit like the old sort of knee-jerk thing. And if they get, at a certain point, the tails sort of lock in together. And so you get a bunch of rats, like between, well, I mean, up to 30 or 35 that have been discovered, all tied together by their tails. And this just seemed to me to be, too good an image to pass up.
It was brilliant, and of course, writing about kidnapping in Italy seems, certainly appropriate. But then you went on to do Vendetta, which takes place in Sardinia. Am I right?
Yep.
And Cabal, which we're back in Rome, and it's actually a sort of a Vatican church kind of, or deep conspiracy, which I think people tend to think goes on in Italy.
Well,
or always worry about the separation or not separation between the Vatican and the
I mean,
state.
this came out of an Italian friend saying, if you're going to, this was after I'd written the first two, which, as you said, Rat King and Vendetta. And an Italian friend said, look, if you're going to write about Italy, you have to write about the Vatican, because, this is the ultimate Italian place. So that seemed like a bit of a challenge. And of course, it is a very interesting setting for a book, because it is like Liechtenstein or Andorra,
Right.
I mean, it's one of those places which is, or San Marino, it's one of those places which is legally, I mean, in terms of international law, it is a separate state. So, for example, every country, including this one, has two sets of ambassadors living in Rome. One, I mean, the Americans have an American ambassador to the Italian government.
Right.
Who has one sort of building with a set of Marines to guard it, and the whole bit. But then there is a separate American ambassador to the Holy See, which is the Vatican State, which is in a completely different part of the city. Has no contact at all with the first one. I mean, they just happen to be in the same city, and there's this little city-state. And of course the possibilities for doing interesting, not to say seriously corrupt or crooked things, there just seem too good to pass up, really.
And it gives you a boundary. Each of the settings you described so far, in fact, acts to circumscribe, the crime, and gives you that close community that works out very well for a crime novel. Then, oh joy, one of my favorite books, we went to Dead Lagoon. I mean, I suppose it was the obligatory Venice book, but it's hard to write Italy without at some point going to Venice, isn't it?
Well, it is, but also, and this is partly a matter of chance. When I did the first one, which we talked about, Rat King, I really wanted to write about the city that I'd been living in for 5 years, Perugia.
Right.
And I obviously needed a detective, and he had to come from somewhere. I happened to have spent Christmas that year in Venice, which was the first time I'd ever gone there. And so I just thought, well, why not? I mean, it was one of the, it wasn't a clever, move. It was just one of those sort of, seems like a good idea, everyone has heard of Venice, let's make him come from Venice. Also because people have the idea, I think, that Venice is a kind of Disneyland, that no one actually really lives there and no one actually works there. Now it's becoming more and more like that, but there are still, there are still about 80,000 people who actually live in Venice and do work, so.
And its history is so marvelously sinister.
But then, you see, having had him come from Venice, I then had to obviously send him back, because you can't have someone come from Venice and not at some point write a book about Venice, because it becomes too much of a kind of looming presence on the back wall.
I think very definitely so. And actually, the books were getting, it seemed to me, darker as we were going along.